Welcome to New Atlas Live. I'm Brian Berletic. Joining me, as always, is Angelo Giuliano. This is the first live stream we're actually doing since the new year, 2023. We thought there was going to be a winter, what were they calling it? Stalemate, but far from the truth. Angelo, how have you been doing the last month or so since our last live stream?
Great. Back to China, and I think it's important just to look at what is happening at the same time. Ukraine and China. China is just a matter of time. We talked about this window of opportunity for the West to fight China in the South China Sea, and so what is this window of opportunity? Is it 2025, 2027? Keeping in mind that time is in favor of China. China is stronger every year, and I think that window is closing. I think this what is critical is also the elections. There's two elections to follow closely. 2024, the U.S. with Trump, if he goes through, and Tsai Ing-wen, the DPP, if they hold onto power or not in 2024. So the window is closing. If they don't have Tsai Ing-wen, the DPP, the pro-independence party in Taiwan, that would be much more difficult with the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang is more for status quo and reintegration with the mainland China. So that's the big question mark here.
Absolutely. This is a point that I've been trying to make recently since I was looking. This was what I was looking for. Let's see if I could get it. Let's get this. I haven't done this in a while. So U.S. General predicts country will be at war with China in 2025. And it's just as you're saying, Angelo. China has plenty of time. They're not in a rush to do anything. It's not China that's going to provoke a war by 2025. It is the U.S. And it is precisely because the United States is out of time. After 2025, 2027, 2030 at the latest, they're out of time. The window of opportunity will close. And as we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in Ukraine. Then we're going to talk about this think tank war game regarding a supposed Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And we're going to see how, even though they claim that it's going to be some kind of victory for the United States, when you look at the end result, it clearly isn't. It almost seems as if the U.S. is already out of time. Let's talk about Ukraine first. And question and answers. This will be open throughout the entire live stream. If you have a question, use capital Q or question in all caps, and then write your question. And if it's relevant to what we're talking about, I will go to it. And then if not, we'll go to the questions and answers toward the end. So this is Ukraine war, 80 years on. We are facing German tanks again. Putin, this is 100% factually correct. Angela, what do you think about, once again, German tanks named after big cats crossing into Ukraine to fight Russians? What do you think about that?
Well, that is dramatic. Just think about it. Just a couple of years ago, this would have been unthinkable. Remember, Germany has a constitution, which is peaceful constitution. It says, they're not supposed to go into war. Some countries that were neutral not long ago, Finland. Remember, Finland, they had an agreement after World War II with the USSR. Finland was supposed to be in the, neutral. And we see those shifts happening overnight. Same as in Japan. Remember, after World War II, which was imposed upon Japan. By definition, Japan has never been independent since World War II. It's a vassal state. But in the constitution of Japan, it says clearly that Japan is not supposed to rearm and it needs to have only a defensive army. Now, in 2019, what they did in Japan was not to change the constitution, but they did a reinterpretation of the constitution that Japan could come at the help of an ally. What happened later, just right after, they said, well, Taiwan is an ally, meaning if Taiwan is attacked, then Japan would protect Taiwan. So you see, there are things that are shifting extremely fast. So what is happening with Germany here? That's extremely shocking. In the psychology of Russians, it's just such an insult, just for Russia. So I think it's a big mistake. And you said it in your videos. Those tanks are not going to make any difference. It's actually might actually bring some complications just because of maintenance. It's just absurd to have two, three types of tanks in such a low quantities. It's absurd, absurd.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not going to make any difference. NATO has already sent hundreds of Soviet era tanks to Ukraine, tanks that they are familiar with, that they could maintain on the battlefield more or less by themselves, although a lot of maintenance has been shifted to Poland because Russia is able to strike their maintenance facilities anywhere they exist inside of Ukraine's borders. So it's not going to make a difference, but they're going to send it anyway. And we can see that the decisions that the German government is making do not reflect Germany's own best interests. As a matter of fact, we're watching Germany self-destruct. Here is a question. This is a very relevant question. What do you make of the Philippines expanding U.S. military ties after Marcos just went on a state visit to China? How is the U.S. going to use Philippines in a realistic strategic manner? Well, that's a good question. And it'll be basing. They want to put U.S. troops in the Philippines. I'll show you that as we get into the CSIS, this think tank, this U.S. government and arms industry funded think tank, their war game, fighting China over Taiwan, where the Philippines comes into play. But yes, the Philippines counts China as their largest trade partner. Germany had such an important economic relationship with Russia, just energy alone. And they have sabotaged that to fulfill Washington's interests, to advance U.S. foreign policy objectives at the cost of the German people. If U.S. troops are based in the Philippines and allowed to contribute to destabilizing all of Asia, the Philippines will pay the price for that, first and foremost. So that is very, very important. I've got a lot of questions about the China issue. So there's this. I want to talk about this real quick also. Human Rights Watch urges investigation of alleged use of landmines by Ukraine. And they're talking about these pedal mines. And I've seen Eva Bartlett talking about this for months. Ukraine showering Donetsk City, a civilian populated area. There are no military targets in Donetsk City. They were showering Donetsk City with these pedal mines. She was shouting from the mountaintops about Ukraine doing this, these mines blowing the feet off of adults, killing children. And now this Human Rights Watch report is admitting that in at least some places, Ukraine is doing this. It should be investigated. And then they cite the UK Ministry of Defense, which claims Russia is the one showering Donetsk City with pedal mines. Why would they do that? It makes no sense. And now that Human Rights Watch is admitting that Ukraine is actually the ones using these pedal mines, it exposes the Ministry of Defense as being, and this should surprise no one, as being absolute liars, projecting onto Russia what they know for a fact Ukraine is actually doing. Before we move on to this CSIS think tank war game, because there's a lot to go into there. Angela, you got any thoughts about this or anything else regarding Ukraine?
Well, the landmines, I think, well, we all know, you and I, we know that Human Rights Watch is just a CIA outlet. I mean, they it's just usually they work on regime change. It's extremely biased. But once in a while, they throw you a bone. They give you something. So it's maybe 5% of the time they might be objective because they have to. You cannot lie all the time. But then they get your attention 95% of the time or on things against Russia. So it's just it's interesting to follow. And here's just they're just pointing out at something, but they're not going to spend much time on this. And they cannot go too far. Just remember, Amnesty International, what they did when they denounced Azov, they were using human shields in Mariupol. What happened? Well, she had to resign. She had to leave because of the report. They canceled the report, and that's not the first time. So they try to do that job, somehow a little bit, but at some point there are limits. Those are those are NGOs used for propaganda, and it's only going one way.
Absolutely. They're propaganda outlets, and unfortunately, they attract a lot of genuine people at the lower levels who do actually care about human rights and are trying to be objective. And every once in a while, they will get information out. But at the end of the day, at the very top of Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, many others, these are fronts. These are not actual human rights organizations. And at the top, that is when they make the political decision to decide what is and isn't a human rights violation based on what is politically expedient for the United States, Washington, Brussels, London. Let's see. There was this question here, and we'll get into this. So the question is, Andrei Martyanov, he had said that U.S. has a decisive advantage over the People's Liberation Army Navy in submarines. Do you think China can counter it somehow, perhaps with Russian help? And I agree with Andrei. My own independent investigation of Chinese submarine capabilities versus the U.S., I think the U.S. does have an advantage. I don't think it's an overwhelming advantage that would ultimately be decisive in a overall conflict. But I think it is an area that China is very eager to level the playing field in. But why don't we get into that? Why don't we get into this war game, and let's see what U.S. government funded and arms industry funded political scientists. And Andrei has a lot to say about political scientists. Also, people should check out his channel. I'll try to put the link in the video description below. So this is it. CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies. The first battle of the next war, wargaming a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And they show these ancient U.S. tanks, main battle tanks. The U.S. doesn't use these anymore, but this is what Taiwan's got. They're going to get M1 Abrams supposedly in years to come. I honestly don't know what difference it's going to make. How about this? Well, why don't I just read how it begins? I'm gonna read it. You can find this online. Just type this into Google. It'll pop up. There's a free PDF with the whole 140-page report. It says, what would happen if China attempted an amphibious invasion of Taiwan? CSIS developed a war game for a Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan and ran it 24 times. In most scenarios, the United States, Taiwan, Japan defeated a conventional amphibious invasion by China and maintained an autonomous Taiwan. However, this defense came at a high cost. The United States and its allies lost dozens of ships, which includes aircraft carriers, several U.S. aircraft carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and tens of thousands of service members. Taiwan saw its economy devastated. Further, the high losses damaged the U.S. global position for many years. China also lost heavily, and failure to occupy Taiwan might destabilize the Chinese Communist Party rule. So they have to call it the Chinese Communist Party instead of the Communist Party of China, which is what it's actually called, CPC. So you already see a lot of politics creeping into what's supposed to be an objective war game. Victory is therefore not enough. The United States needs to strengthen deterrence immediately. Before we get in too deep into this, let's just take a look at CSIS's corporate sponsors. Let's just take a little quick look. Northrop Grumman, General Atomics, they make all of the drones. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, General Dynamics, they make the M1 Abrams. BAE is in here somewhere. So you can see it's all the big, Raytheon for sure is in here, right here, Raytheon. So it's all weapons manufacturers. And so the United States needs to strengthen deterrence immediately. What does that mean? Buying weapons from CSIS's corporate sponsors. Before we get any further into this, Angela, what is your first impression of this war game? And what do you make of CSIS's conclusion that somehow this is a victory for the U.S.? They managed to stop the amphibious invasion, but they practically lose their Pacific fleet and tens of thousands of men. And Taiwan is completely destroyed. What do you make of that?
Well, just objectively, just think about who is CSIS and what is the purpose of CSIS. So they are clearly financed by the military-industrial complex. So what do they want to do? They want to sell weapons. Now, the outcome of this paper needs to be positive in favor of the US. I mean, why would you go into a war where you are telling that the US would win badly, would lose badly? Here, they need to depict that there's a chance actually to contain China, to hurt badly China, to to do a real damage, and just to make sure that China doesn't become the next superpower. But ultimately, it's about selling weapons, and also they need to prepare. They are actually giving us at some point in this paper, they're giving us some positive outcomes, but only if there are prerequisites. They need to do things before that. Some of the things are sending weapons and missiles to Taiwan, just to be prepared for an invasion. Invasion, or maybe there's different scenarios, and not necessarily an invasion. They're talking about a blockade, and then heavy bombing. Um, and here also they need also to prepare politically. They need to prepare the politicians. Those papers are the papers that are going to be looked by those politicians in Washington, and they need to start to prepare the minds of people. And at the same time, there are some actions that need to be taken with the possible allies of the US. So this, it starts, but everything starts from those think tank papers. That's really important. And after that, everything follows. The politicians, the media, and that's what Noam Chomsky calls manufacturing consent. They need to manufacture, and build up. They've been building up China bad for a long time. There's a $500 million per year, which is exclusively finance into financing media for depicting China as being evil and bad. So they've been shaping the minds from media, from Hollywood, and now slowly you have those think tanks. It's going to influence the politicians, and the media are following. And sometimes the media are even more aggressive than all the rest.
That's a really important point you just made there, Angelo. All of U.S. foreign policy stems from these think tanks. You see who funds them. That is who's actually driving foreign and domestic policy in the United States and across the West, actually. It's not your elected representatives. These think tanks come up with these papers. Lawyers transform it into a bill. Lobbyists bring it to Washington to get it signed off on. And then they also bring these talking points to the media to sell this agenda to the public. Just as you say, they're selling it to the public by trying to convince people that China is bad. And I kind of want to get into that. They talk in this paper a little bit about the background. So they say Taiwan is widely regarded as the most dangerous potential flashpoint for conflict between the United States and China. And I think everyone understands that, but I don't think they understand quite why, because the Western media has consistently lied about this for years. I know people in America who honestly think Taiwan is a country, and it is not. And I'm going to prove it to you by reading from the State Department's website here in just a moment.
I'd like Brian. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I wanted to make some parallels because I think this exercise is very interesting to see all the parallels we have between Ukraine and Taiwan. I just came across something. Besides there's a de-Russification of Ukraine. It's clear. It's the same that is happening in Taiwan. There's a de-Sinization of Taiwan. And it's interesting. I saw a video of Zelensky. Zelensky's mother tongue is actually Russian, and
Yes.
in that interview, he pretends he doesn't find the words in Russia. He knows them in Ukrainian, which actually learned recently. Because he's not a native speaker, and then he pretends he doesn't know. But you know what? Tsai Ing-wen, she did exactly the same. She actually, one interview, she was like, "Oh, I cannot find the words in Chinese." And she used them in English. That's how she does. There's a de-Sinization of China, and to the extent that Tsai Ing-wen at some point she even bow. Bowing is an action that actually Chinese don't do. It's not nobody does bowing. Japanese do, and now you have also small details. She say the happy lunar year calendar. Just when it's Chinese New Year. So
Yes.
it's just dramatic, and it's exactly the same. Look at what is happening in Ukraine. It's the same. There's just a time lag there, but it's exactly the same. And I wouldn't be surprised that at some point, if they don't get what they want with the DPP, or the DPP fails, that could be a coup, something, but they won't do it, because they need them on board. And,
Yes.
and I wouldn't be surprised that something as dramatic that happened in Maidan that will happen in Taiwan. They actually, remember, we covered that. They, in 2014, the same year as Maidan, they did the Occupy Central in
Sunflower.
Hong Kong,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then the
Oh, they did
Sunflower
that and
Revolution.
Sunflower Movement. Yes.
Sunflower Movement was exactly the moment where Taiwan and China, they were supposed to sign a trade agreement, free trade agreement. Actually, China and Taiwan they've never been so close as in 2014, 2015. You had both President Ma Ying-jeou in Taiwan and Xi Jinping. They actually met physically. They shake hands in Singapore. And actually, back then, everybody thought, you know what, we are going towards reunification. Until what? Until Sunflower Revolution, and then massive money hijacking Taiwan's democracy, and massive money being poured into media, NGOs, National Endowment for Democracy. And you see right now, you see both democracies, I mean, so-called democracies in Ukraine and Taiwan. Well, they've been hijacked. Now we need
Yes.
to slowly ask ourselves the question: is the people they have to? I mean, China do they have to talk to Taiwan, or do they have to talk to Washington? Because I think right now, Taiwan and the DPP in Taiwan, they're listening to Washington. That's the risk, and we might see a shift, the same as in Ukraine right now. I mean, what's the point? I mean, that's a puppet. Zelensky is a puppet. He answered to who? To the CIA in Washington.
Absolutely. And I think this is a good time for this question. If the U.S. goes to war with China in 2025, what will Japan, Korea, and other U.S. allies do? Well, they'll do the same thing Europe is doing. Their economies will collapse. They'll be bled to death economically, perhaps even militarily, and destabilized politically, and co-opted and subordinated politically, just like Europe is right now to the United States and this proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. It is exactly the same, just as Angelo has just explained, and the parallels and even the years are almost exactly the same. The Maiden, the Sunflower Movement, and it's all the exact same organizations, the National Endowment for Democracy and all of their subsidiaries, people like John McCain and what's the other one? Is it Lindsey Graham, the John McCain's shadow? In Taiwan, in Kiev, in Ukraine. It's the same story over and over again. Now, the point I also want to make, and it's even mentioned in the CSIS war game paper, this paper about their war game, about Taiwan. It's they say they regard Taiwan as a breakaway province. Every nation, it says, recognizing Beijing as the sole legitimate government of China and severing diplomatic relations with Taipei is a precondition for any country to establish diplomatic relations with China. It's called the One China policy, and it means there's only one China. Taiwan is part of it. There's only one legitimate government, the People's Republic of China in Beijing, and that is exactly what the U.S. State Department's own official website right now says. It says right down here, we do not support Taiwan independence. That means Taiwan is not independent. If it's not independent, what is it? It's part of China. And so this is the U.S. admitting that Taiwan is part of China, and yet they're playing this double game where they're encouraging separatism in Taiwan, separating Taiwan from the rest of China when they recognize China's sovereignty over it. And then there's stories like this, because in the CSIS paper, they act as if China is irrationally preparing for some kind of military conflict for no reason at all. It's because of the U.S. undermining Chinese sovereignty. This U.S. nearly doubled military personnel stationed in Taiwan this year. The U.S. has military forces in Taiwan right now, despite recognizing Taiwan as part of China. And we just heard this week all of this hysteria over some alleged Chinese spy balloon floating over Montana, and people are saying, "How dare China fly a balloon over the even if it even is a Chinese balloon." But the U.S. literally has troops inside China's borders, what the U.S. recognizes as territory China has sovereignty over. So I think flying a balloon is a very reasonable counter reaction to what the U.S. has been doing to China this whole time. So there's all of this. People need to understand this background before we talk about war with China over Taiwan, because what it really is the U.S. waging a war with China to violate its sovereignty and create a national security threat to China, all of China, a significant one. Now I got to find this picture.
Brian, do you want to touch
go ahead.
the red lines? I was thinking. I think it's important just for people to understand that there are red lines for China, the same as in Russia. Russia had security concern when it came to Ukraine, and they wanted to protect the people in Donbass. There, in China, I think I can see 3 red lines. One would be to have nuclear weapons to be stationed in Taiwan. One would be a declaration of independence, which is actually, it would go against the constitution. So they would need to change the constitution, which is actually almost impossible because they would require 75% of approval in their chambers, and then they would need to do a referendum. And the third one would be to have a heavy U.S. army to be stationed in Taiwan. I think those, I don't know if you see more red lines, but those are the red lines for China. But again, they for Taiwan to do that, there's a democracy in Taiwan. I think, and they're very sensitive about the people's opinion, and considering, for decades, there were polls in Taiwan that said clearly that Taiwanese, no matter if they were pro-independence or against independence, but 90% of them, they wanted the status quo. So I really think they don't have the support to do such stupid things. So, but I don't know. I mean, again, Taiwan, we had Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan. I mean, symbolically, it's not good, and now the new Speaker of the House, McCarthy, wants to go to Taiwan too. I don't know how far they are going to go, but those are the red lines. I don't know if you see any other red lines, Brian.
Well, I would have thought that putting U.S. troops on Taiwan would be a red line, but when you really think about it, time is so much so on China's side. Just think about in 10 years, even if the U.S. puts 10,000 troops on Taiwan, in 10 years, where will China be? Where will the United States be? There's going to be a point where the disparity between Chinese economic and military power is so much greater than America's power that no matter what the U.S. was trying to do on Taiwan, China is going to be able to sweep it away eventually. And so to go to war over it now would risk destabilizing not just China economically, socially, politically, but all of Asia, set the entire region back decades, which is really the dream of the United States. The United States is a fading power. It is sinking lower and lower and lower. And if you want to stand above everyone else, but you are fading and you are sinking lower and lower, the only way to do that is to make sure everyone else is sinking even faster. So I think there's a method to this madness, this scorched earth policy of burning everything as you retreat from global primacy, in the hopes that you destroy so much that at the end of it, you're the last one standing. Because don't forget, the United States has the Pacific and the Atlantic between it and its so-called adversaries. And it's funny because in this paper, they even talk about, let's see if I can find it. They even talk about how China has almost no way to threaten the U.S. homeland. So they're admitting that China poses no threat at all to the United States. And yet somehow the U.S. is still trying to justify this posture, this threat toward, right here. Yeah, it says Chinese strikes against the United States because the United States will be striking the Chinese homeland. The base case, they're talking about the war game, assumes that the U.S. homeland is not a sanctuary. However, the ability of the Chinese to conduct strikes against the U.S. homeland and thereby affect operations in the Western Pacific is extremely limited, A few special forces might infiltrate and attack a small number of high-value targets, but not enough to materially affect military operations in the Western Pacific. So they're admitting that even in the middle of a war where the U.S. is attacking the Chinese mainland, China isn't even capable of doing it to a certain extent. Now, here's a question, and I don't really get what the mindset is here, but I'll read it anyway. Does Russia and China have any way to stop a salvo of Trident missiles? Yes, they do. They have their own very capable intercontinental ballistic missiles that will scour Washington, New York, Los Angeles, many key cities completely off the map for all eternity. It is called mutually assured destruction, and it is still how nuclear warfare is deterred on planet Earth today. So people should keep that in mind. The U.S. and the U.K. are definitely not the only ones with nuclear weapons. As a matter of fact, Russia has the most nuclear weapons, and they've just recently upgraded their nuclear weapons. So let's keep all of that in mind. Now, I'm trying to keep an eye on the questions and also continue talking. But how about we look at this? So this is an actual map from their war game, and you can see how the United States has forces in South Korea, on mainland Japan, in Okinawa, and you see the Philippines sticking out right here. And we just heard about this week a basing agreement made between the U.S. and the Philippines. And you just look at how close the Philippines is to Taiwan and Okinawa to Taiwan. So this is very key for the United States, because the United States is trying to provoke a war with China over Taiwan, thousands and thousands of miles away from its own shores. It needs to use other countries' territory to wage this war, because they don't have any territory anywhere near Taiwan to do it. And this is mentioned over and over again in this CSIS paper about their war game. Angela, you have anything you want to add to that?
I'm just thinking, what do they have though to gain? Japan and Philippines. Well, keep in mind, when we see what is happening in Ukraine, you have some countries like Poland that have something to gain out of this. They want a part of Poland, what we call Galicia, and so we do understand why some countries in Europe can be very aggressive. Now in Japan, in the case of Japan, I've been trying to see why Japan is so aggressive, extremely aggressive, and I think they have some gains with what is happening here. Keep in mind that Japan hasn't made peace with Russia. They still claim land, Sakhalins, the Kurils that belongs to Russia. They want that land back. It's still unsolved. There are some islands also that are disputed between Japan and China, and I wouldn't be surprised that Japan, has the ambition that maybe if to reclaim Taiwan. Taiwan used to be part, for a very short time, 50 years or so, used to be part of Japan, and then the Philippines, probably some islands. So you see, the thing is that how do you get those vassal states or countries like the Philippines that are just in between, but they have a lot to lose. They need to get something in return. So you side, yes, but what do I get? Why do I get? I have skin in the game now. What do I get? And I think we need to look for what are the incentives. And I think Japan, it's slowly more and more clear. I wouldn't be surprised that at some point, there's, Japan would actually claim part of Taiwan, or if not Taiwan. In the case of the collapse of Russia, of China, and keep in mind that same as in Russia, the long-term plan is to Balkanize Russia, to make Russia, a country, 10 countries out of Russia. The same with China. The long-term plan is to divide it, because China is just too big. It's you need to destroy this nation state. 4,000 years of history to destroy completely. That's the long-term plan. And the only way they can achieve this hegemony, it's just to destroy those two last very powerful nation states that are Russia and China. That has nothing to do with what they're trying to sell the people that we want to save democracy, freedom to Taiwan. I think it's important just to go back and forth. Micro small level, and macro, the big level, the big picture. Because ultimately, there's two pieces they're craving for. It's China and Russia. Russia. It's been forever. That's an unfinished. They've been trying. Through Hitler. The Lebensraum, and also 75 trillion of natural resources, and then China, the last piece. The most populous
Yes.
region in the world, a huge market, and that's it. You have the globalist agenda, which is right there in front of us.
Yeah, and not that long ago, and I did a video with Carl Za, and he talked about the century of humiliation and how the West almost succeeded in balkanizing China, carving it up, and turning it into a colony. And they failed. And this is for them also unfinished business, just as Russia is. There's a comment here. And to get to what you were saying, Angelo, I don't think that these territorial gains for either Japan or the Philippines will be worth the economic destruction that they will suffer. I mean, your economy is gone. You got a new island that is scoured of all human life and industry. What are you going to do with it? Because that's what's going to happen if there is a war over Taiwan. The U.S. said that if China doesn't destroy it, they will destroy it, so that China can't use it. That is also in the CSIS paper. There's a lot of things. I had to do a whole video just on the paper. This says Thailand in 2025 war, pick sides or stay neutral. China has Thailand and China have a very deep and growing relationship. China is their largest export market, largest import partner, infrastructure partner. They buy all of their new military equipment from China, replacing old U.S. hardware. And the largest number of tourists by far come from China, more from China than all Western countries combined. And now that China's open again, that flow of tourism is returning to Thailand. So the only way by 2025 that Thailand will be anti-China is if, as the U.S. has done all across Eastern Europe, overthrown the government, put a client regime in power that will irrationally and in a very self-destructive way cut all ties from China, destroy the economy, divide and destroy society, and turn it into like one of these Baltic states where they're just an absolute basket case with no future at all. And everything that they do, every ounce of bloodshed is for Washington and advancing its geopolitical interests. I hope that answers the question. It really depends on whether Thailand maintains its sovereignty and pursues its best interests, then it will side with China. And if not, it'll side with the US because it's captured and it's forced to, which the United States we're looking at this map and we see the Philippines peeking in on the bottom of the map there. The US has been desperate to get a basing agreement going with the Philippines specifically for this war with China. And I'm sure that they put a lot of pressure on the Philippines. So it's too early to say, is the president of the Philippines compromised or is he caving into pressure where the United States basically said, we will turn the Philippines inside out and upside down if you don't agree to this. It's up to you. You see what we're doing to Ukraine. We could do that to you next. And this is how the U.S. does business. So it's very important to keep that in mind. So we're looking at trying to keep an eye on questions. Oh, okay. So let's get back to the paper, though. I'll keep the map up just so we can keep in mind where this conflict is taking place. The paper is talking about Chinese military capabilities, and I want people to listen carefully in case they believe that China is militarily inferior to the United States. This is a U.S. think tank talking about this. China's A2AD capabilities, that means anti-access area denial. These capabilities are now formidable. China's sizable and sophisticated force of ballistic and cruise missiles challenges the U.S. ability to operate from its few air bases in the Western Pacific, and China's development of anti-ship ballistic missiles threatens to destroy U.S. surface ships. China began launching series production of fourth-generation fighter aircraft in the 2000s, now has more than 1,000 such aircraft in service. Series production of large modern warships, destroyers and frigates, did not begin until the mid-2010s, but progress since then has been even more striking. Between 2014 and mid-2020, China launched 25 Luoyang 3 destroyers and 8 Renhai cruisers. I'm probably saying that wrong. It is currently building its third aircraft carrier, which at 80,000 tons will be much larger than its first two. And then regarding air-to-air missiles, which I think will be key in this potential conflict, balancing the United States' superiority in doctrine and training are the advantages brought by China's long-range air-to-air missiles and geographic advantage. The Chinese PL-15 air-to-air missile outranges most Air Force advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles, all of the variants, meaning that the Chinese will often get the first shot in combat beyond visual range. And in modern warfare, whoever sees the enemy first and fires first usually comes out on top. So China has a huge number of aircraft, longer range missiles. I mean, you tell me how you think it's going to play out. And remember, these Chinese warplanes are going to be flying right off China's own coast. U.S. warplanes are going to have to fly hours from Okinawa or even the Philippines to get to the theater of battle. Angela, what about you're not really, you don't claim to be a military expert, but do you have anything to say about Chinese military capabilities, maybe in relation to how China technologically in general has been advancing and surpassing the West in so many ways?
Well, I think they have a very strong air defense system and hypersonic missiles, the same as Russia. They're not quite as at the level of Russia, but they're very close to Russia. I think that, from my understanding, what is extremely critical for the U.S. is to have the support of Japan and the Philippines, which are, to be honest, I really doubt that the Philippines is on board. I think it's symbolic. I doubt that they would allow. It's one thing to have to be able to station army in the Philippines. It's another thing that to be able to launch attacks from the Philippines. So I would say who's on board? Probably Japan. But that's a question mark. If Japan is not on board, there's no chance. Because you need to do power projection. You are so far from China. What is the closest station? Is the Guam? I mean, it's extremely far. So there's no chance for the US to do anything if Japan is not on board. And I would say, there's in the paper there are things that are quite interesting. It's of course, they talk about amphibious attack, and I think this would be very damaging for China. It's not easy, but at the same time, I think it's at different stages. I think they're talking about the possibility of to do a blockade on Taiwan and to bomb Taiwan and to isolate Taiwan and just see where it goes. The same as they did. You see what we had with Russia. We had some bombings, strategic bombing, infrastructure, and so on. Just hoping to have Zelensky to come to his reason, to realize, well, you know what, I'm going nowhere like this. I wouldn't be surprised that China would take its time, to say, well, just okay, we do a blockade first, we put pressure. If not enough, we do strategic bombing, and at the same time, you do two things together, diplomacy together with show of force. They wouldn't go like what the US in the paper. They actually, I think they focus too much on amphibious attack. You don't need to get to that point. Again, you have. I wouldn't be surprised that you have some rational minds in the army in Taiwan that would say, we need to side with China. We need to side with China because we don't want to fight. I mean, both sides, they agree on one thing, is that Chinese don't want to fight Chinese. On both sides they agree with that.
Yes.
So I think you'll have at some point rational minds. But again, it's all speculation there.
So you talked about air defense. China does have extremely good air defense. A lot of their systems that they've made themselves are based on very successful Russian designs, and they've just straight up have bought air defense systems from Russia, including, I think, several batteries of S-400, which are even the West admits these are the best in the world. So they have one of the best integrated air defense systems on Earth. In the paper, it even says, don't even think about flying over mainland China because you'll be shot down. Angela, I agree with you. This is the same conclusion I drew when I was reading this paper and looking at this war game scenario. Why would China do this amphibious landing? It makes no sense. They could just blockade Taiwan, like they did after Pelosi's visit. They completely shut down air and sea traffic very temporarily, but they demonstrated that they could do it. And then all they would have to do is open up one humanitarian channel from the mainland to Taiwan. And then how would the US justify intervening in any way when that happens? How could they do that? And then all China would have to do is allow the US to come into their A2AD bubbles and just eliminate these ships, shoot down these warplanes. There's no need to put a huge amphibious landing force in the strait to serve as a target for US submarines and anti-shipping missiles. So I agree with that. It's funny, you were talking about Japan has to allow the US to use its bases or there's no way this will work out. And that's interesting because that's exactly what the paper says. It says all of these conditions, not and or all of them, have to be fulfilled. Taiwan must decide that it's going to fight back against China. The US must intervene. If China decides to do this and the US doesn't intervene, then 100% for sure China will succeed, whatever it decides to do. The US must also have the ability to use its bases in Japan for this military campaign. That is an absolute prerequisite, or it's not going to happen. And the US must also have a huge number of long-range anti-ship missiles, which is interesting because we see the shortfalls they have in terms of military industrial output in regards to their proxy war with Russia and Ukraine. They're going to have the exact same problems regarding China. Does the US actually imagine it's going to outproduce China? I don't think that it's going to. I saw a question here, which this kind of touches on this. Do you foresee a Russia-China military cooperation to crush the weakened West and finish off their plans for world domination? Something to that effect. I mean, I have done a previous video with Mark Sloboda and Carl Za about current Russian-Chinese ties. And we just did a video about Russian-Chinese history, which I've finished editing and I am going to publish here very soon. And when you look at the history plus what is going on currently, you can see that Russia and China over generations have been very good neighbors with a few brief episodes, but overall close neighbors, many mutual interests. The US posing a threat to both Russia and China only give them more reasons to get closer together. A lot of people in the West, and we talked about this in the video, talk about the Sino-Soviet split, and they imagine that somehow they can reignite this split and put a wedge between Russia and China. And we concluded that there's no way that's going to happen unless they do regime change in Russia and or China. There's no way that that's going to happen. So it's important to keep all of these things in mind. But this is literally the last sentence in this paper. The bottom line from the analysis is that a successful defense is possible and deterrence is achievable, but it'll require planning, some resources, and political will, which again is just a sales pitch by Raytheon, by Boeing, by Lockheed Martin. Also, we can violate China's sovereignty over Taiwan that we officially recognize and start a war thousands of miles away from our own shores. So far, in fact, that we have to use other people's territory to wage this war from. Any final thoughts on this, Angela? And now everyone ask your questions. It doesn't have to be about what we're talking about, just capital Q question in all caps, and then your question, because we'll just spend some time on Q&A exclusively. Any last thoughts on this CSIS paper, Angelo?
I think we need to put this into a context where you have the collective West, which is being at the moment demilitarized, especially with the depleting of forces. You know, they're sending tanks, they're scrapping whatever they can, actually. You know, and the collective West is getting weaker and weaker, and not only military but also the economies. You see the economy. You know, the IMF said that in 2024 Russia will have a higher growth than Europe. Now China is going to be at over 5%. But then there's one thing which is really important is the de-dollarization which is happening at the present moment. I did a calculation just this morning. In December, China had $900 billion of US bond reserves. but and they decreased by 24 billion. So basically, within the next 3 years, China can actually dump all its US bonds. But China is not the only one. You have other countries like Saudi Arabia. You even have Japan, Switzerland that are actually selling US bonds. What is happening once the dollar is not going to be the global currency? Well, the US will not be able to sustain a budget which is close to $1 trillion of military spending. That is the big question. If de-dollarization will happen faster, the purchasing power of the dollar would be lower. So imagine if, let's say, relatively the US dollar would drop by 40 to 50% within the next 5 years, which is actually possible. With the trends we're seeing right now, it is possible. Well, then you'd have actually the real in purchasing power parity. You will have the real spending of the US, which is divided by two. And the problem is that we actually sometimes compare the military spendings. We need to compare military spending in purchasing power parity, but also we need to look at the US. What the US is actually spending, there's a huge waste. How much the US spend for the F-35? How much, I'm sure when you look at how the Chinese are spending, I'm sure they're extremely careful. And then one thing which is really important, you mentioned quite a few times, in Russia and China, it's military spending, it's purpose driven. In the collective West, is profit driven. This is why you have, it's completely asymmetric what is happening in Russia, between Russia and Ukraine. You see there's waste. I'm sure if you look at what how much cost, the cost and benefit of Abrams and tanks from Russia, it's probably, it makes much more sense, to behave, to do how Russia is doing. It's purpose driven. Purpose driven. You put efficiency. You don't do just in time. We now you don't have, why you don't have any missiles. I don't need to be a military expert. You don't have any missiles because you are business oriented. I get an order, I place an order, and then I produce, and then I get the missiles. 2 years, 1 year, I don't know how long, a long time. When it's purpose driven, you prepare. It's not about making profit. You prepare first. You're going to war, you prepare first. Now with Taiwan, you're depleting you stock in Ukraine. How are you going to do it with Taiwan? This is why they have a huge pressure. And they need to do this paper and to put pressure on the politicians just to be ready for that war, because they're not. They're clearly not.
And people should understand that CSIS says let's spend more on Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed, and even if Congress says yes, let's do it, it's going to be years before you see these weapons produced in numbers and ready to use. Something else that I heard Mark Sloboda say this on a program hosted by George Galloway, and he said this is a war between capital and commodities, and commodities, and then if you add in China, industry. What are your thoughts on that, Angelo?
Well, that's the problem. What we have in the collective West is a financial-based economy. What you have in Russia, it's completely different. It's a commodity-based. It's real stuff. You produce real stuff. The level of industrialization. When you have economies like in Europe, which are based on services, what does it do to you when you go into war? It's worth nothing, absolutely nothing. So I think we need to be extremely careful. And here, when you look at the combination, natural resources of Russia, with a very strong army, very high technology, with production capacity of China. Look at that. Do you think that they will be out of stock, China, when it comes to missiles? No way. And there's one thing I want to add, which is extremely important. You see, the US is actually waging war around the world. How many wars they wage? And they lost. They lost against farmers in Afghanistan. I mean, the last war, I don't know when is the last one they won a war. I mean, it's just probably one island. They took an island, or Haiti. I don't know. China, the Chinese army, they've been preparing since 1949 for this single war. So that means everything, the army, everything has been on focusing on that single war. You know, it's when you prepare for a single competition, that's all you do, and a single task. You are proficient. You are going to be an expert, and that's all you do. The US, you have 800 bases around the world. You do regime change. You know, you span here and there. You know, China, no, it's one single focus, and that single focus, it's about ending this century of humiliation. They need Taiwan for that. And I tell you, when you look at how the Russians are supportive of Putin, I think it's 73% when it comes to the war, you know, to the military special operation. In China, 99%. 99%. There's not a single Chinese that they won't be like, you know what, we will die to get Taiwan back, because it's deep. It's in the DNA. It's you know the pride is so much. They were raped. You know, China was raped by 8 countries. They came in, they destroyed everything. They were like, I take this piece, I take this piece, and slowly China is getting back its dignity. You know, he got back Macau back from Portugal. He got back Hong Kong from the British Empire. Now the last piece is Taiwan, and they do anything they can. You know, but they've been focusing on that single fight. You see the difference? I don't think the US is ready for this war.
And I mean, you kind of touched on it. The United States, for the last 20 years, they have been reconfiguring their entire military away from waging a large-scale war with the Soviet Union to these small wars all around the world, just as you said. And it's not an easy task to go from that back to being prepared for a large-scale, industrial scale military conflict with a peer or near peer competitor like Russia or China or both of them. The United States is not ready. They are out of time. That is why they're talking about war with China by 2025, not because China's going to start a war with the US, because after that, the US has no chance of competing with China. It's now or never. They are out of time. They are rushing. When you rush, you make mistakes. You make mistakes. So hold on a second. So let's go to some questions. Let's do some questions.
Yes, actually, Brian, someone mentioned, you know, the island they won. You know, that was Grenada. You know,
Grenada.
that's the
Yes.
last war that the US won, was Grenada. I mean, there were
Yes.
farmers on that island. You know, I mean, the other wars, you know, was a debacle. You know, and it was actually money laundering. You know, Afghanistan, we find out that it was a money laundering scheme all along.
Yes. This is a question about Chinese and U.S. weapons, a comparison. I mean, you could look at what's going on in Ukraine. You could see this junk that the West is dumping into Ukraine, these Western weapon systems. Again, a lot of this was systems that were developed during the Cold War, and then they were tailored for small wars, and now they're just dumping them into Ukraine for this big war, and they're not appropriate. And so a lot of America's weapon systems meet that criteria. Why don't they have longer range air-to-air missiles? Because they've been fighting nations that don't even have air forces. I did a whole video, though, by the way, on Chinese weapon systems, one variety after the other, multiple launch rocket systems, missiles, tanks, everything. I will put that in the video description below so people can see it. After the live stream is over, I'll put it in the video description. Let's see if there's any others. Here's a question. How are people in China reacting to the news that the U.S. Navy general said prepare for war with China by 2025? So what's the reaction of people in China over this claim, Angelo?
Well, it's not the first time. You know, they've heard it before. But China, you see, there are shows in China. There's many TV channels actually exclusively covering war, you know, potential war against the U.S. and so on. China's been ready all along. They see the long-term plan. That's the big difference. You know, Chinese, they know much more about the West than the West knows about China. I mean, ask any average Joe in the West, in the US, who, you know, anything about China. He might say, oh, I know Xi Jinping is evil. That's all, you know. And when it comes to China, you know, this level of awareness in geopolitics and also military, military knowledge. They are ready for that, ready. They knew all along. They saw them coming. Why China is actually being so sensitive about, there's information space. We talked about this, Brian, you and I. Why China? They were really careful when it comes to internet. Just because that's sovereignty. Sovereignty is not only about land, crossing border. No, sovereignty. China saw it really clearly that, information space was to be protected, because that's how you do regime change and that's how you do meddling. So China, they've been ready for a long time. And they saw them coming. They've been prepared. But the thing is that it was China. They focused on one thing. They were poor. Now they're back to prosperity. And again, the army it's China doesn't have a power projection army. Really, how many army bases China has? China has only one army base in Djibouti, and that's for UN peacekeeping in Africa. But China doesn't do power projection. The only thing China is doing now is actually to prevent how, if China goes to war, how it can be hurt, and what they want to do is containing China and doing a blockade, the same as they did with Japan. They did Pearl Harbor, before Pearl Harbor, there was a blockade on Japan, and they were actually destroying Japanese economy. Well, with China, that's what they want to do, and this is why you have the Belt and Road Initiative. Most 70% of the trade is going through the sea. Now they're shifting slowly towards land, towards the land, and they're finding solutions, but that's the risk. But they're being ready for that. You see, the Belt and Road Initiative started 10 years ago. In 2013, when they signed the agreement, they signed, they had this big meeting in Astana. So you see that vision. It started a long time ago because they knew, they learn history, and that's what they do. They learn through history, and they've been looking, actually, China, I'm sure, they're actually learning of what is happening in Ukraine, they're learning, and I think I wouldn't be surprised that they might be inspired of what they do in Ukraine, because it's very uncommon, this is a war of attrition, slow grinding and so on. China, they're learning, and you have this combination, China and Russia. The collective West should listen. I mean, again, it's not about being pro-China, pro-Russia. We need to point out who's the aggressive one, who's the imperialistic one. When you look at China and Russia, they don't have a hegemonic history. China, the last 100 years, where didn't attack anyone. China is too big. It's focusing on itself. The main focus of China is sovereignty, it's unity, it's harmony, it's prosperity, and it's been delivering. And I think it's a major embarrassment. Just think about from the Western side. We claim we have the best democracy, we have freedom, and so on. But people are starving. People are sleeping in the street. People don't have any dignity. You will own nothing. You'll be happy. Well, China is different. And different culture too. People are pragmatic. Is my life getting better and better? Well, yes. And you know what? You don't need to be a fan of Putin and Xi Jinping, but look at what Putin did to Russia. Mortality. Like life expectancy going up, criminality going down. Education. I mean, everything. Well, no matter if you like him or not, you need to agree that those politicians, they brought something tangible, really. Xi Jinping the same. China, 40 years, they lifted out 800 million of people out of poverty. And that's what China is a continent. It doesn't need to expand. It's big enough. They just want to prosper. And that's a major embarrassment for the world. They want a piece of that. China is doing well. We want a piece of that. We want to get into China and control it. And let's split it between ourselves,
Yes, and you said China does not have a military that can project power, and this is something that the West is always like, look at China, they don't have enough strategic airlift, they don't have sea lift, they don't have any of these capabilities that we have. That gives us an advantage. But what they're admitting is that they are deeply invested in projecting military power around the globe, and China is not, and Russia is not either. Also, by the way. And you were talking about the Belt and Road Initiative and trading over land to avoid a potential U.S. blockade. And this is something that perhaps this conflict in Ukraine and sending Ukraine all these HIMARS and all of these guided rockets, this might come back and haunt the U.S. because part of their strategy of implementing that blockade is using the U.S. Marine Corps, using guided rockets and ground-launched anti-ship cruise missiles, using them to close down straits. And we see China building the Belt and Road Initiative, as you said, Angelo, but we also see the U.S. trying to counter it by literally burning down countries where Belt and Road Initiative is moving through. So just recently, there was a bombing on a train line in Baluchistan, Pakistan. I've talked about this many times. We've talked about this many times. The U.S. is backing armed militants in Baluchistan to sabotage the Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure there. In Myanmar, they have armed terrorists attacking Chinese factories and infrastructure pipelines there. A pipeline that is specifically to help China circumvent the Strait of Malacca. That's why it's there, to go from the Gulf to a port in Myanmar and then straight into China through a pipeline. So they're attacking that. But then because of this situation with Russia and China, now they're interested in expanding trade, bilateral trade, and building pipelines and getting those commodities that used to go to Europe, sending them instead into China. So I think this is going to be a huge and an essential shift in heading off what the U.S. is trying to do. Again, if the U.S. is successful, they are going to destabilize and destroy all of Asia. I live in Asia, and I don't want to see that happen. I don't think you do either, Angelo. Again, it's a lot of questions. What about the U.S. staging nukes in Japan and South Korea? Again, it's very similar to what the U.S. has been doing to Russia, and if they do that, China will do things to counter that. They have plans. China has nuclear weapons they can launch from submarines. They can launch intercontinental ballistic missiles. They have options to counter any sort of nuclear threat by the United States. China. This one. How's the U.S. going to win a war with China if they don't plan on invading the country? Well, the thing is, they're not trying to invade and conquer China. They're just trying to destabilize, destroy China. And by, as Angela has said, the transition, the reunification of Taiwan with China is inevitable. The peaceful reunification, it is inevitable. And the U.S. knows this, and they know they're out of time. And what they want to do is make China pay the absolute highest price possible for getting Taiwan back fully in the fold. And so this is why they're doing this, to make it as costly as possible, to hurt China economically, politically, militarily, in every way imaginable. They want to make it as painful as possible, which is exactly what they're doing to Russia over Ukraine. They want to make that process to extend Russia. They even wrote a policy paper, Rand Corporation, extend Russia. The same plan is being used against China, extend China. They just, not to my knowledge, they haven't titled the paper Extend China, not yet. Let's see, other questions. And Angela, feel free to jump in.
One thing. Yeah, Brian, a lot of people have still the old concept of, you control a country, you need to have boots on the ground. And when you see the US, they're controlling many countries. They have vassal states since World War II. To name a few, Germany, Italy, you have Korea, you have Japan. There are U.S. Army on the ground. You have 50,000 U.S. Army in Japan. What happened with the U.S. is that you do regime change and you put people that you can control, that are actually going to obey to you. So you don't need to have boots on the ground. You see Zelensky, you find the right puppets. You need just some agents around him, CIA. You need to control the critical people. So what they want to do with China, it's they might never get to China, but if they can contain it, they in their wet dream, I think they would love to have China just to go back to Stone Age, just containing. Yes. What happened to Iraq? Iraq, there was nothing. Iraq 20 years ago and Iraq now is the same. It's and ideally to create failed states. You balkanize them, create chaos, because it's not about I'm going to do better than them. In order, the collective West, the way they think, it's about in order to do better than them, I need to destroy them. I push them down. I might, just have zero growth, nothing, no progress. But it's relative. In absolute
Yes.
terms, I'm not going to grow. There's not going to be prosperity. But I squeeze whoever wants to get out, and that's what they've been doing. Just think about Africa. They've been doing that over and over. Debt trap diplomacy, and they just keep them poor. There's no electricity. They want to impose on Africa. They come and they say, oh, you need to control the climate. This whole climate change agenda, the Greta
Yes.
sect. Those woke crazy guys. They go to Africa and they say, oh, we need to have a sustainable world. You know what? There's no electricity. There's no electricity. They want them to stay poor. And ultimately, people, they really need to pay attention to that. It's not about only containing China and Russia. That's about containing the global South. A lot of countries are depending on each other. You see, it's critical for China that actually Russia wins, because it's going to have an impact on Russia. But also, there's a global South, Africa, Southeast Asia. It's critical for them that China doesn't collapse. This globalist project doesn't go through, because it's going to be about containing all the global South, keep them there. Because what China did, why China invested so much into not only the Belt and Road Initiative, but actually into Africa, into tangible infrastructure, because they wanted to do a win-win. And by helping them somehow, it's about lifting up the global South, and ending the U.S. hegemony and imperialism. That's what they want to do, and this goes against this globalist agenda, because it's about keeping a very small elites. And again,
Yes.
when I say elites, it's not about Europe, the US, and so on. No, it's an elite within the global West. The global West, the collective West. It's because ultimately those wars, is it going to benefit the average Joe in France or Germany or the US? No, because actually they've been containing them internally. So ultimately, it's going to be average Joe that is going to fight the wars, but not for him. It's going to be for those globalist elites.
It's a really good point. The U.S. deliberately arresting development around the globe versus China building everyone up. I think we all know in our personal lives, people who seek to dominate everyone around them, and they do it by pushing everyone down, keeping them down so that they can stay on top. And then there's other groups of people who bring out the best in each other. And there's mutual respect and there's mutual benefits to these relationships. So it is a stark contrast between the two. And I feel that is a good way to break down the difference between American-led unipolarism and multipolarism. China developing all of these countries, they're empowered, they are developing, they have the means to do things on their own. And what you see is a greater balance of power across the globe. The US, just as you said, Angela, they come in, they destroy everything, they knock you down. Every time you try to build something, they come in and they knock it down. So you never develop that ability to have that power yourself. So it is that really is where the battle lines are drawn. You talked about not needing boots on the ground to control a country, and you mentioned Ukraine. That is a perfect example, because that's what the U.S. did in 2014. They captured the Ukrainian state. They overthrew a government that represented Ukraine's best interests. It was far from perfect, but it did. And they put someone in power in Kiev that was going to make decisions in the interests of Washington at the total cost of Ukraine. People have to keep that in mind. Let's see. Let's get to some other questions. What would the position of India be in this conflict? Yes, it is a nuclear power, has a sizable military, and it could potentially tilt the balance one way or the other. India is a very close ally with Russia, and we've seen their decisions during this conflict in Ukraine. We've seen that. And even though India doesn't have a very good relationship with China historically, I think there's a lot going on between India and China that people really don't notice behind all of the rhetoric, where there is cooperation and there is trade. And I think ultimately, if they can get past whatever these differences are, they know deep down that it's in their best interest to move on together. And hopefully, Russia can serve as the glue to make that happen. But I just don't know. Germany, you would have sworn that Germany would have fought harder to protect the Nord Stream pipelines and would have fought harder to prevent the US from coming in. But they didn't. They completely capitulated to the United States, and they are destroying themselves in the process. Maybe something like that can happen in India. I don't really, honestly, India is not my strong suit, so I don't want to say too much about it. But it is a large country, and there's a lot more going on there than I think people realize. Angela, you have any thoughts on India? Which way it would go?
I think we need to look at well, you have leaders that actually are putting their country first, and you have other leaders that are actually working for the globalist agenda. So you have Scholz in Germany, who is not working for Germany; he's working for the globalist agenda. You see, I'll give you an example. Macron actually, before being elected, he was pre-selected by the World Economic Forum. He was a young global leader. That's an entity which is actually belongs to the World Economic Forum. So he was pre-selected, and ultimately, once you pre-select them, it's going to be a few candidates that are pre-selected, and then people, they go to vote, and it gives them the illusion of a free choice, but ultimately it's whoever is elected needs to be pro-EU and follow the globalist agenda. So this whole concept, when it comes to the EU, you have leaders that actually they get elected only if they are they fulfill the criteria of being in line with the globalist agenda. And ultimately, I think I mentioned this before, but this EU project was after World War II, was a CIA initiative. Actually, you had what they call the two fathers of the EU of Europe. You had Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet. They were actually CIA agents, and the idea of the EU was to actually destroy the nation states and actually to transfer the sovereignty from the countries to Brussels. So ultimately, no matter who you elect in Europe, in France, or whatever, the decisions are made in Brussels. That's the so there's an illusion. When we look at Europe, just and at the beginning, the goal, it was actually because there was they wanted to do a defense system in Europe, and the goal was against that. The goal actually saw that coming. But you see, back then, he said, I'm going to enter into EU because I will influence the EU, because France was the biggest economy, actually, because Germany was not united back then, reunited. So France was really strong. And so, but de Gaulle didn't have any choice, and what happened in 1968, color revolution, because de Gaulle was too strong, color revolution. And then you had this fake left that came into power, and so you see, I think we just need to review what is the fake sovereignties of European countries and fake democracies, because ultimately, we said it over and over, whenever we talk about democracy, we need to have sovereignty first. Yes. First, because it's a process of self-determination. So whoever talks about, when they talk to me about EU countries, democracies, and so on, I'm like, it's not. It is. You want to be a serious politician in France, for example, you need to be Frexit. If you're not Frexit, exit of France from the EU, then the rest are just clowns. It doesn't matter who you elect. And you saw, first time, you see normally in the EU, it should be, foreign policy should be president of nation states. What happened in Ukraine was actually they exposed completely that actually the decisions, von der Leyen, she actually was coming in front of everybody saying, oh, we are going to give billions there, we are going to send weapons, we are going to fight a war. Well, that exposes clearly, and where the others are coming from, that's Washington. So, yes. Now, when it comes to Russia, long term, Russia and China, they won't talk to the EU. If it's important, we'll talk to Washington because you're working for Washington.
And wasn't there a German politician who openly, publicly said that I don't care what the German people want. We're going to keep supporting
Baerbock.
Ukraine.
Yeah, Baerbock.
Yes.
She said that. Baerbock. She's the one actually. She said, we are waging not against a war against each other, but a war against Russia. Wait. Word counts. And she's foreign minister. You should know minimum of diplomacy. But this is the new generation of 30 years old and so on. The telegenic people that are elected and they don't have much in the brain. Sadly.
Absolutely. I think this is an important question. I think you kind of touched on this already, Angelo. What if KMT gets into power next election, and they decide, I don't really feel like being on an island that all life and industry is scoured from its surface. So we're not going to go along with the U.S. on this and be the next Ukraine. What exactly will happen? I think it is a popular. What people don't realize is that there was a local election in Taiwan, and it was more or less an unofficial referendum on Tsai Ing-wen and the Democratic Progressive Party's talk about independence and anti-China. And just as you were talking about, Angela, this creation of this artificial fake culture for an equally fake country that does not exist, versus just recognizing that you're Chinese, you are Chinese. Your government is actually called the Republic of China. It's just like in Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, they're Slavic, and they imagine that they're like some sort of lost Aryan tribe. It's absurd. It is dangerous. It's self-destructive. How do you see that? If KMT, the U.S. will interfere in the elections in Taiwan. The whole system is rigged by the U.S. The Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, the National Endowment for Democracy, that is one single organization. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think they can rig the elections successfully, or what? How do you see that playing out?
Well, long term, the minds are shifting, but there's a reason for that. They're building up this identity, the same as they did since 2014 and actually they started earlier. There was first before that there was 2004. We need to remember there's a 2004, 2005. There's an Orange Revolution, in Ukraine, and what they started to do back then was to rewrite the history books. So you start building up this new identity. They start saying, I don't know what they say, but sometimes it gets absurd. That Jesus was Ukrainian. I don't know, whatever. But they say they start rewriting this whole history, and that's what they did in Taiwan. In 2003, you had Chen Shui-bian, which was from the DPP, the pro-independence party, which is controlled by the US. They changed the history books, and when you change history books, it doesn't matter. Kuomintang, they're not going to come back. If they're into power, they can, it's too sensitive. You're not going to change again history books. But in those history books, it says that, Taiwan's history starts in 1949, and actually they put into the brain of Taiwanese. They say, well, we are closer to Japanese culture. And you go to Taiwan, actually the shift is, there's so much influence of Japanese culture because you're touching the kids. You're touching the kids, the impact of having a full generation. Since 2003, you have 20 years of brainwashing of kids. And now you go to Taiwan, you talk to kids, and they say, no, you know what? We are Taiwanese, we have this identity. We are close to Japan, the US and so on. I mean, this whole brainwashing, and actually they're following so much the US that actually the Taiwan has been the first country to allow gay marriage. I mean, just because they want to be
Western.
as woke, Western. Yeah. This wokeism. It's big in Taiwan. So you see, and I remember when I was in Taiwan, I used to study Chinese in Taiwan in 27 years ago, and I remember every single Taiwanese, I would ask them, and they would say, we are Chinese. Now, 27 years later, they all say, well, we are Taiwanese. So you see, this slow, brainwashing. When you control when you control everything, I mean, the media, they have suppressed actually a lot of pro-Chinese media in Taiwan. They started suppressing some freedom of speech. You don't, if you are too much like pro-Chinese, they are going after you, and they've been arresting a military personnel. Some of them, some military, staff, they, some are very high up there, like a major. And they went to prison because they said, you know what they said? They say clearly, if we were to be attacked by China, we will lay down weapons because they are our brothers. And
Yeah,
so you
common
see,
sense,
yeah,
self-preservation, also.
yeah, exactly. I mean, Genghis Khan don't get said, don't get into a war when you're sure to lose, because I mean, you see, it's so obvious. I just wish the Taiwanese, they would see how much they're being used, And again, this thing is that what China wants to do, it's actually not take over Taiwan. It's not, it's not about invading and so on. They want to do a one country two system. What they say to Taiwan very early, that one country two system means that you can keep your political system. There's no interference. You even can keep your army. It's just symbolic. The return of Taiwan is just symbolic. In reality, nothing changed. Nothing changed. And actually, I was here in Hong Kong in '97 during the handover of Hong Kong to mainland China. But you know what? For 27 years, nothing changed. Nothing. A lot of people, they were alarmed. They left. You know what? All the people that left in '97, they were actually all the rich people that left. People with money. They went to Canada. They went to Australia, to the US. They all came back. And they're very prosperous now. But you know what? Nothing changed. So in reality, the return of Taiwan to mainland China, it would be nothing changes.
Well, I would suggest there will be a change, and just hear me out. Uh, when the national security law was finally implemented, what
Yeah.
did change was all of these U.S. funded agitators dividing and destroy. I mean, literally destroying Hong Kong. I mean, burning things down, attacking people. Some people were actually even killed, horribly mutilated. They uprooted all of that interference. So that is something that changed, and I believe in Taiwan that will also change. So gone will be the Democratic Progressive Party and people like that who are going to make irrational decisions to serve Washington's foreign policy objectives at the cost of Taiwan. Because if you look at the economy of Taiwan right now, because of this irrational hatred that they're trying to cultivate against the rest of China, they are hurting themselves economically. They are destroying their long-term prospects by doing this. I believe that China will uproot this element of foreign interference and subversion. And I think things will go along because China has many different regions. We're lied to by the Western media. There's many different regions, and they are allowed to do things in their own way. Their language, their religion, all of these things are not touched unless they become vectors for foreign interference. That's very important for people to understand. Here's a good question right here. What are your views on China's intervention in Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bhutan to contain India? I don't think that China is trying to contain India. I think this is all part of how China does business everywhere. They go to these countries, they do business, they spur development, they invest in development, in infrastructure. Some of these countries have significant problems with poverty. They're underdeveloped, and there's nothing stopping India from working with China to develop these countries. If they really care about these countries, they could do that. And I think eventually they will do that. But if you look at India, and it's very easy for people to stereotype. I know a lot of people in India who really do like China, admire China, and wish there were better relations between India and China. But there are certain people in India who absolutely and utterly irrationally, in terms of racism even, hate China, hate the Chinese. They don't care. They don't care what they do, what they say. They just hate them. And that is irrational, and that is the type of mindset that will destroy a country. It's doing it to the West. It will do it to India if they're not able to put that segment of the population in check. And I'm sure that China does do things because India, again, they have some issues between India and China, and I'm sure they both do things to each other to antagonize. They're not neither one is blameless. I will say that, but it doesn't have to be that way. And I think the hurdles to getting toward cooperation are not nearly as high as some people suggest. We'll do a couple other questions. You have anything else on
Yeah,
that Angelo?
yeah, I want to add one thing. There's a lot of people that say, well, China has so much influence in Africa. They're investing, they're doing debt trap. In reality, it's not China that is actually seeking actually projects. In reality, China works like a shark tank. You have a project, you go to China and you say, well, I need that money. And can you help me? I mean, and why are they going more to China than India? Well, because China is a lot. China has a trade surplus of $1 trillion per year. It's massive. So when you have this trade surplus, you have lots of excess dollar, out of this trade surplus. So China is willing to recycle its U.S. trade surplus. And so those countries, they come to China and say, and they come, and the project, need to be viable. If it's viable, then China actually gives conditions. What is interesting, the difference that China, and actually this is Reuters saying it, the interest rates that China is asking is less than half of what the IMF and the World Bank is asking. And the conditions are, there's no strings attached, meaning, it's not like there's no meddling saying, well, you need to
Be
open up your country
communist.
to NGOs or be communist.
Yeah.
They don't care about this. There's no meddling. It needs to be sustainable and very important. It's long term. It's not, because when you do short term loans, that could be a problem. And what happens sometimes is that they are, if they come to an end, of if the country has problems to pay the interest, those can be renegotiable. And actually, it's very, they haven't said it, but recently China forgave billions of dollars of loans from Africa, which actually the collective West never did. So
No.
so you see, it's like China. They say China has so much influence and so on. Well, you know what? A lot of countries go to find China because China, they come up with solutions, not only in terms of infrastructure in engineering, but also funding.
Yeah, and I agree with this comment. India is a great country. I have great interest in Indian culture and history, and also their food. It's actually popular in Thailand, and there's a lot of influence from India throughout the generations. Both India and China in Thailand. As a matter of fact, if you look real closely, you will notice that it is really a mix of Indian and Chinese culture. So it really is a shame that there isn't better relations, but I think eventually there will be. Now, I saw another question about the social credit system in China, and this is just one of hundreds of things the West constantly lies about China regarding. And I put a link to a video that I did on the social credit system, and I show you using Western media sources that they admit that this does not exist. It is not what they pretend that it is. It is a very reasonable system that companies use. And there are things like, if you're on a train, if you ride the train all the time and you smoke on the train, they'll blacklist you from riding on the train. This is common sense. It's not like if you don't have a picture of Xi Jinping above your door in your house, you can't get a loan or something. It's not like that. And the Western media even admits it when you dig in a little bit. And that goes for a lot of things that we hear about China, the human rights issues, all made up. And we've done, Angela and I together have covered this. I have written articles and done videos for years about this topic. This is propaganda to poison the West against China to justify America meddling in China's internal political affairs, threaten it and its national security, put U.S. troops on Taiwan, despite recognizing it as Chinese territory. It's to do to China what the U.S. has done to Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, Ukraine, Serbia. The list just goes on and on and on and on. Let me try to find one more good question. We're at about an hour and 30 minutes. Angelo, so what have you heard any recent ridiculous claims made about China? Them opening the country up. I thought there was going to be millions and millions of dead Chinese. It seems like they've completely gotten over it. Actually, people got a cold. There were old and vulnerable people who did get seriously ill and pass away, but it was not nearly the catastrophe that the Western media said it was going to be. And because China waited until whatever variant was going around was not particularly potent, and everyone was able to move on with their business. So they actually very successfully dealt with this for a country of 1.4 billion people. I think that's probably the most recent, most ridiculous, and quickest the quickest death of an anti-China narrative that I've seen in a while. It's gonna be doomsday for China for opening up, and then I haven't heard anything about this. Angela, have you? You're in China. Are the
Well,
streets empty? Do you see like just a plastic
oh,
bag blowing across the street and there's nobody around? Are you talking to mannequins because there's no people around?
no, no, it's back to normal. The thing is that, well, the government acknowledged that they should have done it earlier. They should have opened up earlier and more gradually. They admit the mistake. You see, that's one proof that the government is listening to people. But in reality, there was a poll that was done by Western entity, and they said that actually before opening up, there was still 70% that actually approve of the central government policies when it came to COVID. But then people were still getting very frustrated. So what happened is that it was very shocking actually that you had probably half of China that got infected within 2 weeks. It was just crazy. You would ask people around you, and everybody would say, "Well, I get affected." People died. A lot of people died.
Yes.
Yes. But people that were actually, this minority of people, weak, older people, and they went through that. But when you look at the proportion, it was nothing close to what happened in the collective West. And very important, we need to really pay attention. Again, people, they did support all along the zero COVID policy. And keep in mind that actually China was locking down in big cities, doing lockdown randomly, only in a few big cities. But China
Yes.
during COVID for a long time, it was normal. There was actually, you for 2 years at the beginning, nobody would talk about COVID because as just business as normal, business as usual. So just misconception. But again, uh, their policies should please Chinese. Who am I in the West I mean, my voice doesn't count. If Chinese, they like what they did in China and so on, that's fine with them. And there's a huge approval, and that's embarrassing for the collective West. I like to compare, really like the support you have in the West for the government. For example, in the US, you have, I think it's 25% of support when it comes to the Congress. They don't trust their politicians. In China, you know what? And this is MIT, Harvard University doing polls. When 95% of Chinese, they love the CPC, like it or not. It
Yes.
doesn't need to please me, but they like it. You know why? Because Chinese, their culture and their values are different from ours. They want stability. They're very down to earth. It's like they want tangible stuff. You go to Chinese and you say, "Oh, freedom." You say, "Well, you know what is worth your freedom if you don't have a house? What is worth your freedom when you don't have anything to eat?" I mean, they're very practical. It's just like, I want to be able to send my kids to school. I see that my life is getting better and better. My life expectancy has been going up. In the US, the only country in the world that has been going down, actually. Life
Yes.
expectancy, this is basic human right. And, the metrics of human rights are right there. We need to, compare apple to apple. Life expectancy, access to education, free healthcare, disposable income. In the West, when you have 10% of inflation and your wage still at the same level, well, you know what? You earning 10% less than last year. You're poorer
Yes.
than last year.
Yes.
Uh, well, you see, tangible. Talk about tangible. Well, China is delivering. CPC is
Uh,
delivering. That's an
yes,
embarrassment. You know what? I'm angry because I do wish that my government just maybe get some inspiration. Why don't you start delivering? Not promising, but deliver, deliver.
I saw someone accuse us of being sycophantic toward China. I've been to China and I am impressed. And before I went to China, I really didn't know because I was still kind of, this was back in 2006, 2007. This was before they even built the high speed rail network. And think about that. I traveled from Shanghai to Kunming by just ordinary train, and they had signs, coming soon. Fast forward to today, they have the largest high-speed rail network on Earth. No other nation even comes close. They move billions of passengers every single year, and that's it's not just the train. I was in Shanghai, I was in Kunming, and I watched the entire countryside go past me as I was on that train. I think it was like 2 or 3 days, and I was impressed. I was impressed by the infrastructure, the quality of life. You just look at people around you. No, it's not perfect. Nowhere is. But if you look at that and then seeing what I'm seeing now in China and the way China is helping other countries rise up here in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Laos had no train at all. Now they have a high-speed rail line from Kunming to Vientiane, which then connects to the standard train here in Thailand. They're building a high-speed rail link here. I'm impressed. This is what I think a global power should do. This is what they should be doing versus what the U.S. Did over the last several decades with their primacy over Asia. What do they have to show for it? This void that China is filling right now. And Angelo, you live in China. And this is the thing. We say good things. It contrasts so greatly to what people are used to hearing in the Western media because what they're hearing are all lies. If you look at what we know, we all agree. Most people in the comment section, they will agree. We're being lied to about Ukraine. We were lied to about Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, all of these places. Do you honestly believe that China is the first thing they're telling the truth about? No, they are more desperate to contain China than anyone else on earth. Their lies are going to be the most absurd, most ridiculous. They will invest more trying to spread these lies and get them to sink in than anything else. I think people should realize that. Angelo, how do you feel when people say, "Oh, you're just sucking up to them because you want a higher social credit score"? You want them to unweld you from inside your apartment.
Brian, I'm going to give you an example. Let's say it's your family. Let's say your brother. Your brother, you love dearly your brother, but you see that your brother is not taking the right decisions. Because you love him, because you are close to him, you are going to tell him he's wrong. Good friends do that. So why do I criticize the collective West? Because I do love my country. And I'm frustrated. I'm very frustrated about the direction it's taking. Because the direction it's taking is going to be, it's World War III, could be mutual annihilation, and it's completely wrong, But ultimately, I'm not. I mean, why would I be pro-Russian and pro-Chinese? I to be honest, I'm kind of neutral. I want the world to prosper, and then I see lots of specialists, self-proclaimed experts on China just coming out. They haven't left their office in Washington. They have no clue. But I have people, humane experiences, since the last 27 years in China. It's very humbling. I went through my journey that, very arrogant at the beginning. I thought that I knew, and what happens that slowly, when I started having wisdom, when it was like that, when I realized that I didn't know, that was the first level of wisdom. And then slowly you become more humble and you start saying, well, you know what, let me try to look at China with Chinese eyes, which is extremely difficult. One lifetime, it's not enough. And then you start learning so much, and then, and this is what we should be doing. Why don't we learn from each other? There's lots of good things that actually China actually, is actually loves learning from what the West does well. We should do exactly the same. People go to China and see the way they're doing. It's just it's just different. But let's learn from that. And I would suggest for people, if they If you go to China, let's say you take a flight to Shanghai, the first 24 hours will change completely your perspective on China, because you will arrive in one of the most modern airports in the world. You will take a fast speed train of 400 kilometers an hour to go to the center. No, that's 10 minutes drive. It's just amazing. 400 kilometers an hour. You arrive in Pudong. In Pudong, it's the new side of Shanghai, extremely new. It's just amazing. It's mind blowing. The most modern place in the world. Everything is, like electric cars, extremely modern. After that, everything will change. You reach a new paradigm, and it's humbling. It's humbling because dimension, everything is bigger, nicer.
Yes.
It's just amazing. So why China is doing so well? Well, we need to question. What are we doing wrong? And I think one of the biggest problems, especially when it is to compare with the US, it's well, you know what? When you spend $1 trillion into what they call defense, but it's not defense. It's military. It's in waging wars around the world. That's where your money is going. While that money could be well spent into their people. And you see the life of people is getting worse and worse. An average American, you were a couple in the 70s. You were a couple. You had 2-3 kids. You had couples where you had only the husband working, the wife not working, and you could raise 3 kids and you could buy a house. Now I see in the US, you have people working 3 jobs and they're still homeless. Sleeping in their cars. They have 3 jobs. The salary, the minimum is how much is it? It's $6, right? Or $7. They want to
don't know.
change.
I haven't lived there for like
It hasn't
pretty much my
moved.
entire
It
adult
hasn't moved
life.
for 10 years. Yeah, but it hasn't moved for 10 years. The minimum wage. There's inflation. Have you heard about
Yes.
inflation? I mean, they just so you see, it's just we're doing things wrong, and the problem is that I don't need, and it's not about the label being communist. I don't really care about those labels, but I think we're not going to the right direction. And I think in general, we see. Remember when we talked about the decline of Rome? Rome was becoming decadent and so on. Well, we're living that decadence now. You
Yes.
you live that decadence where we go into kids. They unstable, and you say, well, and you say, well, you are a boy, but maybe you a girl, or you like girls, but maybe you like boys. The
You know what
direction.
it was. You know what it was with Rome was the entire the ruling class were so detached from reality. They were being handed this empire that they did not build. They did not have the skills to build something like that or even maintain it. And generation to generation, it's just unraveled. Things happen much faster now because of technology. Technology is a catalyst. It accelerates absolutely everything. You could see the ruling class in the West. These are people who have no idea how anything around them works. Does Vanderlei strike anyone as someone informed who understands what's going on around her? No, not at all. So we have to just look at what's going on in the West. I think everyone can agree that things are not the way that they should be. And then when we look at, say, Russia or China or any of these countries the U.S. has a problem with, why do we believe anything the West says? So, Angela, your advice for people to go to China and see for themselves, I think that they should. And if they can't, they should try to do the next best thing. Go online and try to find something objective that you can look at that is not telling you one way or the other. On YouTube, there are channels where it's just someone with a 4K camera walking around the streets of China. Just watch it and look at what the streets look like for yourself. And ask yourself, is that what you thought China actually looked like or not? You will be blown away, even watching a video on YouTube. So there's ways you can do this research objectively, see for yourself versus what you're being told. I promise you, I promise you, I would bet anything on this that I'm correct about this. The West is not telling the truth for the first time when it comes to China. So we've been going over an hour and a half. I want to put this last. This isn't a question. This is a comment. No empire has ever gone away quietly in history. And I think that is the bottom line of what we're talking about. The U.S. proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, this build up toward a proxy war with China over Taiwan. This is the U.S. refusing to go away quietly. We have to keep up the hard work of digging into all of this, exposing it, informing people about what's really going on versus what we're being told is going on by the media, which is lying about Ukraine and Russia and also China and everywhere else in between. So that is what we will do. That is what we tried to do today. We will try to do it again. We'll try to get back to doing live streams regularly. Friday evening if you're in Asia, Friday morning if you're in the US. I'm not sure what it is in Europe, but usually around this time of the day. Angelo, thank you so much for taking time out of your day, your evening, really, on a Friday, no less, to come and talk with me and the audience. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for tuning in. Please like and share. Check the video description below for places you can find and follow Angelo's work. He's on Twitter. He's got a YouTube channel. And there's also a list of places you can find my work. There were a couple of videos that I referenced in the live stream. I'm going to add those to the video description after the live stream is over. So thank you again. Thank you, Angelo, and everyone. Thank you. And we'll see you next time.